who were announced as those will be one of the caretaker teams for this particular election. He will be the head of national tallying. Let's now bring in Felix Odhiambo from the Electoral Law and Governance Institute Africa. He's also an electoral lawyer, to just take a look at these new changes. Do they inspire confidence for you, going by what has been happening in this country since we went to the polls?
No, not at all. It could be interpreted as a step in the right direction,
yes.
Only to the extent that the chairperson of the Electoral Commission is keen to replace those who are gravely responsible for bungling the 2017 elections. But the truth of the matter is that, and I agree with some of the people who have given their comments,
yes.
that these are cosmetic, these are a drop in the ocean, and the bottom line is that almost all the six, Marjan, who is currently the deputy CEO, is working under Ezra Chiloba, taking instructions from Ezra Chiloba. And just about the rest of them were either returning officers or county managers working under the director of elections. And so the question is, will they take orders from Chebukati, or will they take orders from their bosses who are still also in the commission? As I was coming here, I was wondering, walking down the memory line. And the truth of the matter is, the greatest deficit to our democracy, electoral democracy, even despite the promulgation of the new constitution, is how we manage our elections. The Supreme Court was very clear that, and indicted the IEBC. I don't know what else Mr. Chebukati is still waiting for. But when the Supreme Court judges ruled in the majority and stated very categorically that the IEBC either willfully or neglected or refused to conduct an election in accordance with the Constitution, Chebukati doesn't need to wait for the reasoned judgment of the court. That is evidence enough. But also, secondly, what is shocking me, that even after being indicted for violating the Constitution, the first decision that the IEBC makes after the Supreme Court ruling is a decision that is in violation of the Constitution, and that is the wrong interpretation of the election that we are faced with in October.
In October.
Sorry. Yes.
But why do you think it was the wrong interpretation? Because there has been argument of what was said in 2013 after the question was posed by the Attorney General. We've also seen Ekuru Aukot is heading to court to file a petition to the Supreme Court. Ideally, what should have been the right interpretation for this?
IEBC is confusing two elections. Article 138 of the Constitution, Article 138(4) of the Constitution talks of a presidential runoff. And the runoff is occasioned when no candidate wins 50% plus one, or at least 25% in half the counties. The Constitution is clear. In that election, that is a presidential runoff. Secondly, that election will be conducted within 30 days of the date of the first election.
Yes.
Now, the election that we are faced with, at least according to the Supreme Court ruling, is an election contemplated under Article 140 of the Constitution. And that is a fresh election. It's an election arising as a result of an election that was declared invalid, null and void. What it means is the presumption that there was no election in the first place, and therefore it is a fresh election. The difference is that in this election, this election has to be conducted within 60 days. What it means is that it's more than enough time for doing a fresh nomination, and it's an election that is open for everyone. That is the difference. Now, IEBC has chosen to narrowly interpret or wrongly interpret the Constitution. So they were indicted for violating the Constitution. The first decision after the Supreme Court ruling is a wrong interpretation of the Constitution.
But looking at these new changes that they have made, you've mentioned very rightly that the IEBC was indicted, but they've since said they will be waiting for the full judgment of the six-judge bench after Mohammed Ibrahim fell ill. So ideally, how was the IEBC supposed to go about this? They are the same commission that are supposed to conduct the elections, but there are some people who should have faced the axe.
And that is the point. I mean, the Supreme Court showed us the way. If it is a question of cowardice, then all that the chair of the commission should have done was to borrow the leaf from the Supreme Court. The courage, the boldness, and the resilience that characterize or that inform the Supreme Court judgment should be passed over to the IEBC. In every election since 1992, we've had problems with how we manage our elections. We've changed the law. We've enacted a new constitution. We've changed personnel. We've disbanded commission. And yet, in every election, we must then deal with the question of managing our elections. I can promise you, today is 6th of September. The election that is set for 17th of September, October, will probably be worse, managed badly than the election of the 8th of August. I can promise you that.
Felix, when an election is bungled,
yes,
who is most responsible?
The Electoral Commission. The buck stops with them. Look at the example. I mean, this is just look at the body language or the conduct of the election the IEBC since. If you look at the Constitution did two things. Number one, it entrenched political rights as part of the human rights. And it obligated the state and the state agencies that in implementing the Bill of Rights, the chapter on the Bill of Rights, the state or the state organ must adopt an interpretation that best favors the enforcement and the enjoyment of that right. Now, the body language of the IEBC since has been to adopt an interpretation that best curtail the enjoyment of that right. Look at the last decision on the election that we are faced with on October the 17th. It is an election that is denying other people an opportunity to contest that election. That is a curtailment of the right. Now look at, the decision, look at the court cases that we had. With regard to Al Ghurair, the printing of ballot papers, with regard to the KIMS, the technology, IEBC routinely and repeatedly sought to curtail instead of expanding the scope of enjoyment of that right. So to answer your question specifically, the buck stops with the IEBC. And what Chebukati has to know, and he must be told in no uncertain term, that it is good to change personnel, but what we need, or what the country needs, in light of the Supreme Court ruling, are far more reaching decisions and reforms that goes beyond the personnel. Look at KIMS, for example. There has to be a holistic audit of the technology that was used in 2017. The August 8th, 2017. Chebukati himself, his name and password was used to log into that system 8,000 times. According to the court-appointed ICT experts, there was no communication between the polling stations and the IEBC servers. So where did these results come from? There are serious, and then most importantly, there was evidence of intrusion and logging in, logging out, deleting Forms 34, uploading Form 34, transferring Forms 34. Now, these are far more fundamental problems than changing personnel. Secondly, there were evidence of illegal polling stations. There were evidence of illegal returning officers. These are the issues that IEBC and Chebukati must address if it's to give us an election according to what the Supreme Court said. But from his body language, Chebukati is not in charge.
NASA has also come up with a list of people that they say should step aside if IEBC is to conduct this election, one of them being the head of ICT, head of the legal team, head of the whole election, and even the CEO, Ezra Chiloba. What are your thoughts on that?
I fully support that. I mean, it's a question of responsibility. In other democracies, like, for example, India, I think, quite recently, the Minister of Transport resigned when there was when a trail derailed in India and people died. Never mind that is a completely different department, but it only falls under him. Why NASA is right is this, and it's as simple as this. IEBC was the first respondent. And the Supreme Court, forget about what politicians say, the Supreme Court found that IEBC neglected or refused to do and to conduct an election according to the Constitution. What that means is that the buck stops with the CEO of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission. Secondly, the department that is in charge of elections operations is the department that is headed by Immaculate Kasait. Equally, that department was indicted by the Supreme Court, and you will see in the recent judgment. Thirdly, IEBC willfully neglected to conduct an election in accordance with the Constitution. That the buck stops with the legal department of IEBC. And then most fundamentally, there was evidence of interference with ICT, so the buck stops with the director of ICT. So those are very reasonable demands and requests. And it's not about NASA. It's actually about the Supreme Court ruling. If we had to be a country that respects the rule of law, then if for nothing else, let us respect the Supreme Court ruling.
In terms of the powers and privileges that the IEBC has and the calls for let so-and-so resign or be fired from the Electoral Commission, just take us through what powers the Commission really does have in terms of overhauling, so to speak, the whole system.
Let me first of all say this. There have been demands by other quarters that the Commission and Chebukati should also resign. Why I caution the country from going that direction is that 40 days is a short time, and we cannot throw away everybody within the IEBC, including the commissioners. Secondly, if Chebukati was to be forced to resign and the commissioners, then what it means is that there would have to be a fresh appointment process initiated to replace Chebukati and the commissioners. If you look at the process of appointing the commissioners according to the IEBC Act, is a process that begins with the vetting process, but then goes to the Parliamentary Committee on Justice, then the Parliament sitting as a plenary, and the final person that makes the appointment is the President of the Republic of Kenya. Now, because of the invalidation of this election, President Uhuru Kenyatta does not enjoy full powers of the presidency. According to Article 134, he is a temporary incumbent, meaning he cannot appoint or fire any state officer. So if you throw away Chebukati, then it means that we will have a constitutional crisis. But then the problem that we are having is that based on the Kriegler report, and when we enacted the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commissions Act, we thought that the problems of the ECK during the ECK was caused by an overbearing commission trying to load it over on the Secretariat. So the IEBC Act made a distinction between the Secretariat and the commissioners. But if you look at the conduct of this Secretariat, one is the most partisan and the most incompetent Secretariat. And therefore, as a reform question, we have to go back to a situation where the commission chairman is in charge of the overall election management, and that is exactly what is happening in Ghana. But the truth of the matter is, the commission sitting in the plenary and Chebukati can make internal arrangements in the Secretariat, because the Secretariat, the CEO was appointed by the commissioners led by Ahmed Isaac Hassan. Yes.
So ideally, what really was Chebukati expected to do in this situation? You've seen how other countries handle their electoral commissions and how all the other electoral commissions conduct themselves. So what is wrong with this one we have?
The difference is autonomy. This is the commission that enjoys, more than its predecessors, sufficient and adequate independence and autonomy, both political and financial. And yet, this is the commission that has routinely refused to exercise its full powers. I'll give you an example. The CS Education come on TV and say that IEBC should consider holding the repeat elections before October 17th. That was given the reasons that the minister said, they were reasonable. And then, predictably, Chebukati takes exactly the date that the CS Cabinet Secretary has recommended. During the Supreme Court proceedings, the Attorney General suggested to the Supreme Court how to organize this calendar. The Deputy CJ, Philomena Mwilu, looked at the Attorney General in the eyes and told him that, thank you very much, but we are in charge of our own calendar. That is exactly the enjoyment of independence that IEBC should learn from the Supreme Court. Now, Chebukati goes and picks the same date. So even if there was some reasons and some legitimate reasons to consider that date, the fact that it comes from the CS Education, who absolutely has no powers to direct the Electoral Commission, then it's suspect. And that is exactly what the Supreme Court did. Now, if you compare this commission with other commissions, I'm telling you, Ghana has some of the most competitive elections, and it's as polarized as Kenya. But when the Electoral Commission speaks, both the National New Patriotic Party that is in power and the National Democratic Congress respects it. It is independent. It is legitimate. It has earned its reputation based on critical decisions, and it has earned its reputation based on the perception of independence. When the Electoral Commission of South Africa speaks, everybody, including the firebrand Julius Malema, respects it. But when our Electoral Commission speaks, despite the constitutional protection, then you wonder whether they really understand what their role is.
Quickly, I would like us to end, but Jubilee has been seen constantly to be on the defense for IEBC. Is this a worrying trend? It
is a worrying trend. Why this is the case, nobody knows. And what should happen is the test for a legitimate commission, and I've said this in the past, is the ability of the IEBC to look at both Jubilee and NASA and tell them no, and live with that decision. But if they can't keep on, swaying like a pendulum, both sides, all this time, then IEBC should read the Constitution and the IEBC Act and understand once and for all that the Constitution and the IEBC Act guarantees functional, administrative, and fiscal independence.
40 days to the election, Felix. What are your recommendations to make this thing right?
One, the IEBC must hold the election in a strict conformity to the Constitution. That is the starting point. The Supreme Court said it. And what that means is they must be the fidelity to the Constitution, the Elections Act, the IEBC Act, and the Election General Regulations is absolute. Secondly, there were a number of issues that the petitioners raised during the Court of Appeal proceedings. Chief among them is the question of ICT and the technology that IEBC used. Based on the court reports, there were serious problems with that. IEBC must fix that. Thirdly, IEBC must advertise afresh all the presiding officers and returning officers for the purposes of these elections. There is more than enough evidence that the officers that they appointed massively failed them. They cannot go for the repeat elections with this stuff. But finally, IEBC must come up with a mechanism of elaborate consultations of all the stakeholders involved. If they continue making this unilateral decision, then I can promise you, today is 6th of September, the repeat election will be worse than the election held on the 8th.
All right, let's wait and see how that goes. Felix, always a pleasure to have you here on KTN News Desk. Felix Odhiambo is an electoral lawyer and also from the Electoral